Hello, and welcome to the Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, coming to you from MVTV, community television here on Martha's Vineyard Island. And today we are paying tribute to the late Senator Ted Kennedy. Ted did a lot for the country, he did a lot for the state, and he did a lot for Martha's Vineyard. And there are lots of people on Martha's Vineyard who worked with Ted on a number of different projects. And we're delighted today to have William Marks, who's going to tell a story that I knew nothing about how Ted Kennedy helped to save lighthouses here on the island. William, thanks for being here.
My pleasure to be here, Ann.
And what is the story?
Well, the story is back in the mid-'80s. Well, even before that, but believe it or not, people on Martha's Vineyard really did not care that much about their lighthouses. They became electrified in the 50s, and prior to that, to be fair to the island, Dionys Coffin Riggs, I remember relating a story that she wrote for Martha's Vineyard magazine called May Day. But there was a tradition on Martha's Vineyard, and maybe you'll remember this. On May Day, the islanders would get together and go up to the Gayhead Lighthouse. And that was when we had a lighthouse keeper. And sometimes they would go by horse and wagon, or horses, but they would go up to the Gayhead Lighthouse and celebrate May Day, and the lighthouse keeper would open up the lighthouse to the island. And on May Day, there was something about women asking men. Is that,
like Sadie Hawkins Day?
Yeah, like Sadie Hawkins Day. A woman could ask a man, or bring a man a present. It was a little flexibility on that day. So there was a tradition hooked to the Gayhead Lighthouse especially, relative to celebration by the island community. And then the lighthouses became electrified. They got rid of the lighthouse keepers. In the 50s, Gayhead was the last town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to obtain electricity in the 50s. And when they did that, they electrified the Gayhead Lighthouse and got rid of the keeper. And ever since then, it was closed to the public. And over the years, the interest of the people of Martha's Vineyard, their interest waned. So that by the mid-'80s, the lighthouses basically were being trashed. You're talking about graffiti, you're talking about broken windows, you're talking about moped races around the lighthouses. You're talking about beer bottles and champagne bottles being broken inside the lighthouses, with graffiti inside the lighthouses, the smell of urine inside the lighthouses, you know. So there was a point where the community lost that intimacy with their lighthouses. So that in the mid-1980s, when I was doing research on coastal erosion with scientists from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, the captain of the Coast Guard at that time, when I asked permission for storing our scientific equipment in the lighthouses to make it easier instead of having to pack up every evening after doing our surveys, he said, yeah, we can give you access to the lighthouse. He said, but, I said, it's right now, it's being slated to be torn down. Now, this was about 1983. And I was in shock. They're going to tear down, and so they were planning on tearing down the Edgartown Lighthouse, the East Chop Lighthouse, and the Gayhead Lighthouse. So we got the key to put the survey gear that we were using with the scientists in the lighthouses. And my wheels kept turning about, well, you know, I'm inside the lighthouse going up to, you know, it was such a thrill the first time I walked in the lighthouse. And I said, I can't believe they're going to tear this down. And this kept bothering me, so eventually I talked to the board members of Vineyard Environmental Research Institute, the institute that I founded, and put forth the proposal of our taking on the position of trying to save the lighthouses. And they gave the green light. We had Jody Reston on the board back then, Jonathan Mayhew, Peg Littlefield, We had Fairleigh Dickinson Jr., we had the actress Linda Kelsey, we had the director of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Derek Spencer, on the board. We had a very good board of directors. Peter Vincent was on the board of directors. And so I went to Washington, gave testimony before Congress, but in that phase, that delicate phase of dealing with Washington, that is where Ted Kennedy weighed in the background, as he was known to do, and to do it in such a diplomatic and suave way. I mean, this was the man at the epitome of his powers at that time in the 80s. In spite of the setback from Chappaquiddick, as you know, he was then even considering running for president again, which he did, but it was a failed attempt, but he came close, which showed almost like a forgiveness by the people toward that tragedy that happened on Chappaquiddick. But I'd have to say, Ann, if it wasn't for the help of Ted Kennedy linking arms with Congressman Gary Studs, because it was the congressional subcommittees that had the handle on the lighthouses, and Studs was on the Coast Guard subcommittee. It was Kennedy in the background, and Frank Lautenberg from New Jersey also helped a little bit, but mostly it was Ted Kennedy. And we were successful after a couple of years of having the 3 lighthouses turned over to Vineyard Environmental Research Institute. But that wasn't the end of Ted Kennedy's involvement, because soon after the lighthouses came to Vineyard Environmental Research Institute through a 35-year license. By the way, when I signed that contract, it was with the United States of America. You know, and it's a very long, lengthy license, you know, legalese, goes on page after page. But at the very end, I signed for the Institute, and above that was the United States of America, turning over the lighthouses. And it was a moment of historic note, because it was the first time in the history of the United States that active lighthouses that were still being used for navigation because of their lights, were turned over to a local organization. So soon after the lighthouses were turned over, we did a fundraiser at the Hot Tin Roof. And Ted Kennedy came to the fundraiser, and he was joined up on the stage. We had Rose Styron reading some beautiful lighthouse poetry. We had Kate Taylor and Hugh Taylor singing Island Lights song that was composed by James Taylor. We had the Rear Admiral of the United States Coast Guard, Richard Bauman. And with Ted Kennedy came his son, Teddy Kennedy. Carolyn Kennedy came to give support. And a host of other people. Carly Simon was there. She sang a song. Dennis Miller from Saturday Night Live. And could you imagine Dennis Miller coming
Absolutely.
from Saturday Night Live to do this fundraiser at Martha's Vineyard?
On the same stage with Rose Styron. I love it.
Could you imagine? I mean, that was the talent that we had turnout. And of course, when I drove up to the Hot Tin Roof, when we were having that event, there was a line of people all the way out into the parking lot. We had to turn people away.
Wow.
But the significance of Ted Kennedy's presence at this fundraiser was the fact that this was his first island appearance since Chappaquiddick. So in a way, it was a catharsis for him, the community of Martha's Vineyard. And at the same time, I feel that in talking with Ted Kennedy here and on Nantucket, because I was involved when he helped save the Sankaty Light and rebuilt that. I sailed with him on the Ernestina for the dedication of the rebuilt Sankaty Light, and a fundraiser that they did on Nantucket, because I was so intimately involved with lighthouses. But the island owes Ted Kennedy a big thank you for what he did for our lighthouses, what he did for this island. And you're going to be doing, as I understand, a series relative to Ted Kennedy, Ann?
Yes, I hope so, because the Island Trust Bill was very, very important to the Vineyard. And it would have protected more than we have now.
Yes.
But the fact that we have any protections at all, I think, are as a result of the Island Trust Bill. And if Ted Kennedy hadn't taken the interest and the time and really worked so hard, and lots of Vineyarders worked with him. So yes, we're going to be talking about that with some other people.
Because beyond the lighthouses, he has done a lot for Martha's Vineyard.
Yes, he has.
But we owe the fact that the 3 lighthouses are here under control now after managing the lighthouses for 6 years. My life became very complex with books that I was writing and traveling and many other things in my life. So I did not have the time to manage Vineyard Environmental Research Institute. The Institute didn't have the money to hire someone to take my place. Basically, I was operating the entire Institute for free. And I was also serving on the board of the Dukes County Historical Society, which is now the Martha's Vineyard Historical Society, and transferred the license to the Historical Society, where it remains today. But our 3 lighthouses are under local control because of Ted Kennedy, working hand in hand with Gary Studs. And it was so beautiful when Ted Kennedy came to the fundraiser at the Hot Tin Roof, because you know, here is a photograph of Ted Kennedy at the Hot Tin Roof, and with myself and Rose Styron reading her poetry. But there's a quote, and also this is the half-page presentation of the fundraiser in the Vineyard Gazette. And here it talks about, come join Carly Simon and other friends of the lighthouses for an early evening of entertainment at the Hot Tin Roof on Wednesday, August 27th, 5 to 8:30 p.m. Senator Edward Kennedy speaking, Rose Styron reading from poetry and literature, and Kate Taylor performing, Dennis Miller, and a host of other people. You know, of course, Kate Taylor and Hugh. But Ted Kennedy said something that is kind of humorous. And I have a tape, and I'm looking for that so that you can make it part of this show, Ann.
Senator Edward Kennedy, a familiar island visitor, was an honored guest at the Lighthouse Benefit.
I want to acknowledge the work of President Marks, who has done so much in establishing VERY and establishing the board. It shouldn't be any doubt to people that I'd want to join or be a part of this operation. I can remember when he called me some time ago and said, will you be a part of this operation to gain the lighthouse? And I thought he said the White House, and I joined on right away. Then I found out that we're preserving the 3 lighthouses out here in Martha's Vineyard. But
The Gay Head Lighthouse was built in 1856 and at the time of its construction was considered one of the 10 most important lights on the Atlantic coast. It was originally equipped with one of the first Fresnel lenses in the country. That original light is now preserved by the Dukes County Historical Society on their Edgartown grounds. This mighty brick and sandstone tower is the most famous historic structure in Gay Head, and its light marks the entrance to Vineyard Sound from Buzzards Bay. Jonathan Mayhew, VERY board member, explains its significance to the island.
The Institute has been working on this project for about 2.5 years now, and the idea is to help maintain, take over the maintenance of the lighthouses, 3 of them on the island, and we're also going to use them for study purposes for erosion, and Personally, to me, I'm very pleased about it because I've grown up being a fisherman for about, well, all my life, 14 years actively, commercially. And although lighthouses have lost some of their importance in navigation due to Moran and radar, they still are the most accurate means of getting a position on the ocean when you use a landmark. And for that reason alone, I like to see them maintained and not have, we have problems with vandalism on the island. And there's a certain, throughout the history of the United States, I think the lighthouses have been important, and they have more than just for the visual effect. They are also, they have symbolism with regards to enlightenment, and to use them for study is a very natural thing, I think, and I think that a lot will come of it when you're working right on the cliffs and on the places working on erosion. I think it's going to be a very good atmosphere for the students and the instructors and scientists that will be working here. So I hope it works out to be a very good program for everyone concerned.
The location of the Edgartown Harbor Light opposite Chappaquiddick Island is a source of pleasure for islanders and visitors alike. Sunbathing, swimming, and beachcombing are all popular pursuits, but a close inspection reveals serious deterioration in its base. Very intends to raise the funds to repair and maintain this imposing structure. Very consultant and associate Dr. David Aubrey comments on the role of the lighthouses in scientific research.
I think the lighthouses in Martha's Vineyard are going to be very important resources, not only for my research, but for the research for various types of research that's going to take place in the future on Martha's Vineyard in anticipation of this increased sea level rise and beach erosion, and just studies of the marine biology and the ecology of Martha's Vineyard. With the housing prices and the land prices rising so fast on Martha's Vineyard, it's going to be a very expensive proposition to set up a separate center for marine studies on Martha's Vineyard. I think that the presence of these lighthouses provides an excellent opportunity to utilize these resources for expansion of marine scientific efforts on Martha's Vineyard, particularly for examining problems such as habitat destruction, beach erosion, effects of greenhouse gases, and so on.
Margaret Littlefield, another Very board member, also has fond memories of our island lighthouses.
And I always remembered Knobsker Light, because we'd go down to the Knobsker Beach and go swimming, and the lighthouse was always there, and it was sort of part of us, and it was like a friend. And then I was always interested too, because, you know, my father was an officer in the Coast Guard, and I don't think you probably knew that. And then when we came over, and then when I came over here to the Vineyard, well, of course, I knew some of the people that were with the lighthouses here and knew the different families, and it was always interesting. You'd say, well, where do you live? I live in the lighthouse. And this was unique. So they are part of our heritage, and they are part of the Vineyard. They're a very wonderful part that we should not let go into decay. And it's up, and I'm very happy that Very is going to take over and make repairs on them and keep them up, because it will be a great credit to us, and it will be a wonderful thing to pass on to the future generations, because they didn't live when there were, and see the houses that went with these places when they were there, but at least there will be something there for them to enjoy, to help preserve, and to keep. And I think that's very important.
The East Chop Lighthouse is located on the highest bluff in East Chop, called Telegraph Hill. It differs from the other two lighthouses not only in its unusual color, but its unusual interior. The walls are of brick laid in the basket weave pattern. Being inside this lighthouse is truly a New England experience, with the winding staircase that leads to the top of the tower. The East Chop Lighthouse was part of a signaling system begun in 1828 that operated between Cape Cod, the islands, and Boston. The tower stands an impressive 79 feet above the water it overlooks and offers a breathtaking view. This cast iron Italianate tower was constructed in 1876 and replaced the wooden lighthouse that burned to the ground in 1869. William Marks, the president of the Vineyard Environmental Research Institute, on the walk of the Gay Head Lighthouse, explains what these historic landmarks mean to Very and the island.
What I think it means, Randy, is that for the first time in the history of Martha's Vineyard, that the people here have an option of local control, of doing something to preserve these historic structures. And personally, it's the beginning of a very long road. The 35 years of maintaining something like this is a very big responsibility, and it's not something our institute is taking lightly.
Senator Ted Kennedy at the benefit recalled a story his brother related to him about the importance of the sea.
Finally, I would just say that perhaps we ask ourselves why we're always might be tied to the sea. I remember some words that my brother mentioned in 1962 at the time of the America's Cup race in Newport, Rhode Island. I'll paraphrase them roughly. They're pretty close to exactly what he did say. And he was mentioning about how life changes, but he was also talking about the sea, and he was mentioning that the sea changes, and the light on the sea changes, and ships change. And he was also talked about the percent of salt in the water. And he was pointing out that the salt in the water is the same percentage as the salt in our sweat, and the salt in our blood, and the salt in our tears. And so when we really go back to the sea, we are really going back from whence we came. And when we preserve the lighthouses, the others matters which mean so much to all of us who love the sea, we're really preserving part of ourselves. That's what we're doing. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. And I'm glad to be a part of this event. Thank you.
And thank you. You're all beautiful tonight. And the Lighthouses, thank you. And thanks for making our first Lighthouse benefit a success for Martha's Vineyard. Good night. And thanks again.
The Martha's Vineyard Times, you see here, lighthouse care given to local group. And this made national news relative to our organization taking over the lighthouses here.
Good. Raising awareness.
And I don't know if you're aware of this, Ann, but Martha's Vineyard is the only location in the United States in such a small geographical area that has so many lighthouses.
Well, that's because of the historic importance of Nantucket Sound, which historically has been the second most traveled waterway in the world. And one of the reasons we know this is that somebody was appointed to keep track of vessels going back and forth, and that there were times when you could look out and see literally 100 vessels going between the mainland and the vineyard.
And when was this, Ann?
The 1800s. It was recorded for a number of years.
You know, there's that is mentioned by the Rear Admiral of the Coast Guard as well, that the heavy traffic that came through here.
Only the English Channel had more traffic.
So on a global basis, this was the second busiest
Exactly.
travelway for ships.
Right.
How amazing. And then also, too, as you know, there were many catastrophes.
Of course. But thank heavens we had as many lighthouses as we did.
Yes. Ted Kennedy says here, and to quote, "I believe in the lighthouses and believe that they are an integral part of Martha's Vineyard, the Cape, and all of the country. It is no surprise to me that the first preservation of a lighthouse is taking place in Massachusetts." He added, "Our tradition and history have been tied to the sea, and only in the immediate era, but to the War of 1812, the Revolution, and World Wars I and II. The Gay Head Lighthouse was very integral to the defense of the United States coast during World War II. Because the Coast Guard station was there, and a triangulation of the radar for submarines between from Gay
yes.
Head to No Man's Land to the point out in Provincetown and Cape Cod. You know, relative to Chappaquiddick, you know, we can't change history. And I feel that it is something that dogged Ted Kennedy to his dying days. And if there's forgiveness in the universe, and if there's a penance to be paid, I really truly feel that he is deserving of forgiveness, and I sincerely feel that he paid an awful penance for that tragedy that occurred.
Well said.
You know, I can't think of it in any other way, but you've met him, I assume?
No, my husband worked with him very closely on the
Yes.
Island Trust bill.
Okay.
But what impressed me, I think, the most about Ted Kennedy is what a grasp he had of the common man, if you will, that he knew about us as people, and that he cared deeply about civil rights. He cared deeply about people and their everyday struggles. He knew what those struggles were. He was not an elitist at all. And not only did he speak to us, he spoke for us, I think, more often than not. And I think he was a brilliant senator. I think that we've never had a better senator. And I think that what he's done for the country and the awareness that he raised and the work that he was involved in is inspiring on every level.
You mentioned Jim was involved with the Island Trust bill. And I remember briefly you mentioned how that was initiated through Ted Kennedy's work. Could you expand on that a little? I'm a little foggy on that history. I used to visit here in the early 70s and moved here full-time in the late 70s, so you know.
Well, the Island Trust bill was designed, and by Kennedy and his office, to protect open land. And the Vineyard was struggling with a great deal of building that was going on, and people were aghast at how much land was being bought up and being built on, and what was going to happen with open land. And Ted Kennedy was the one who saw it as a regional approach and wanted legislation, U.S. government legislation. The Island Trust bill got voted down. But if it hadn't been for that, and again, the raising of awareness, we never would have had the Martha's Vineyard Commission, which was put into place right after the failure of the Island Trust bill, and which, of course, as we know, is working very, very hard today.
Remember in the early 70s, big controversy when they built the condominiums down in Mattakesa in Edgartown. And that was because we didn't have any zoning anywhere on Martha's Vineyard. You could just do whatever you wanted.
Right. And again,
that's frightening.
Town by town,
Yes.
it was very different. And that's why a regional approach, and of course the island has fought a regional approach to anything tooth and nail for as long as it could. I've heard it said that the only regional thing that ever really worked on Martha's Vineyard is the high school. And Lord knows we fought that long and hard until it was an inevitability.
Ted Kennedy's legacy on Martha's Vineyard lives on, like we did with the Martha's Vineyard Commission. And as a result of that, of the zoning that we ended up getting island-wide, the 3 lighthouses, I think, are a tremendous, palpable presence of his caring for the vineyard and a legacy that he's leaving behind for our island as a symbol of his caring for Martha's Vineyard, as a symbol of being a sailor and the safety of ships and people out at sea. And part of our testimony that the Institute gave before the congressional committees referred to many times the island's maritime history, the whaling history, the sailing history. Most island people don't know this, Anne, but what was being proposed, Edgartown Light was considered defunct. I mean, not necessary at all. And then East Chop as well. And the Gay Head Light. Now, the reason why they were tearing down the lighthouses in that era of United States history, which in fact they did do, tear some down, was because the Coast Guard was strapped for cash. They could not afford to maintain those expensive structures, the shells, the bricks, the painting, etc. And in some places where they tore down the lighthouses, what they constructed in their place, if there still was a need for some sort of an aid to navigation, was a steel skeleton tower, kind of like a mini Eiffel Tower, but it was basically steel that would rust and then stop rusting. So it would blend in with the environment a little bit with a strobe light on top. And that's what they were using to replace the lighthouses. So at that time in history, if Ted Kennedy didn't come forward, and if we didn't have a nonprofit institute with a caring board of directors, then we would have lost those 3 lighthouses. And we would have, at this time, these little steel things with a strobe light on top. And now, look we had President Obama visit the Gay Head Lighthouse. We've had many music videos done at the Gay Head Lighthouse. It's been featured in several movies. So, and the same thing, the Edgartown Lighthouse is one of the most photographed lighthouses in the world. We have weddings now at the East Chop Lighthouse, Gay Head Lighthouse, and the Edgartown Lighthouse. What a wonderful thing for the bridesmaid to go up on top of the lighthouse and to throw her bouquet off to the maids in waiting.
Right.
And for the bride and groom to be up on top of the lighthouse for a photograph. What a great place to come for their anniversary, to come back to Martha's Vineyard and go up in the lighthouse. So the Martha's Vineyard Historical Society is booking a lot of weddings. You know, they're so photogenic. So in many ways, you know, Ted Kennedy left this legacy that so many people enjoy without really knowing of his energy, his sacrifices, and what he did for the island.
We're now continuing a conversation, but we decided that there was a lot of stuff that we were talking about after the show, and we needed to do this again. You have some very graphic pictures in the piece that you gave us about the terrible neglect and the bad condition that the lighthouses were in, which is why the government wanted to decommission them and get rid of them.
Yes.
But we had also talked about how vineyarders love their lighthouses.
The islanders truly do love their lighthouses. And when the Coast Guard had lighthouse keepers at all of our lighthouses, there were lighthouse keepers in houses attached to most of the lighthouses. Cape Hogue was attached, Gay Head it was attached, East Chop it was attached, Edgartown it was attached up to until 1938. The public had access to the lighthouses because the lighthouse keepers were there. And then eventually all of the island's lighthouses were electrified, and eventually the lighthouse keepers' cottages or their homes were torn down. And the reason why they were torn down is because it was very expensive for the federal government to maintain them. And they were torn down all across the United States. And then afterwards, the islanders were not allowed to visit the lighthouses anymore because there was no lighthouse keeper to open them, and it was all controlled from Woods Hole. So from the 50s, well, let's say around 1952 is when the Gay Head Lighthouse was electrified. And Gay Head was the last town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to receive electricity. So they electrified that lighthouse, and then within a couple of years afterwards, they tore down the beautiful Gambrel Lighthouse Keeper's house that was attached. That I believe Charlie Vanderhoop was born in. as hard as it is to believe right now, who is taking lead on that. In the 80s, we're going through a terrible economic crisis as well. There were many crises visiting the island at that time. And so after going to Washington and giving testimony before congressional committees, myself and the chairman, John Bitzer, of the Vineyard Environmental Research Institute, we convinced them, with the help of Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman Gary Studs and other people. It was so amazing that this happened, that we convinced them to turn over the lighthouses to Vineyard Environmental Research Institute, which they did in a 35-year lease between the United States of America and Vineyard Environmental Research Institute. And I remember signing the contract, and I signed as the founder and president of the Institute, and on the other side was a list of all these governmental agencies with signatures for the transfer to occur, and we were the only, as you'll see in that Ted Kennedy clip, we were the only citizen organization in the United States to receive control of functioning lighthouses that were still functioning as aids to navigation. So we received control of the lighthouses, and we did the repairs, necessary repairs, and cleanup of the 3 lighthouses. And we opened up the Gayhead Light first. And like you said earlier, and people will see in the graphics of the video, the Gayhead Light had broken windows up in the lighting room upstairs, a rusted door. The windows on the side of the lighthouse had broken glazing through which rain and sleet and snow were coming in. We had several break-ins at that lighthouse, a lot of break-ins at East Chop. There was graffiti inside the lighthouses. You could smell urine. Beer cans, you could smell the alcohol. And we cleaned them up, made them safe for the public. And when we opened up the Gayhead Lighthouse, and we created Lighthouse Park, we put the fencing around it for the first time. And we opened up for the first time to the public since the 50s. But Ann, so many adults came when it was announced we were opening up the Gayhead Lighthouse to the public. They came streaming in. And story after story, they said, the last time I was in this lighthouse, I was a kid. And I was in grade school in West Tisbury. As you know, all the island towns had separate schools. And all the schools would bring the kids up to the lighthouse to visit the lighthouse keeper. And here they were all coming with their childhood memories. And then we had busloads of kids coming from all the schools on the island. And it was the same thing. We had Charlie Vanderhoop, who was born in the Gayhead Lighthouse. And big Charlie with his booming voice. We'd have all the kids surrounding him, and he would talk about being born in the lighthouse, helping his dad trim the wicks of the whale oil-fired lens, the Fresnel lens that we now have at the Martha's Vineyard Historical Society's grounds. And even that lens, Ann, when they electrified the Gayhead Lighthouse and they changed over to the shotgun style of the relatively modern lighting then, they were going to take, I think there's about 1,021 handmade crystals in that Fresnel lens. Because again, the Coast Guard was short on money, they were going to take a sledgehammer and break up that beautiful Fresnel lens and bury that lens in the ground up near the lighthouse.
That's shocking.
Isn't it shocking?
Yes, that is.
Because again, of money shortages.
Right.
And that was in the 50s. We're coming out of World War II now. Well, we had, fortunately, the Dukes County Historical Society, so named at the time, and people of Edgartown raised the money to move that lens where it sits today on the grounds of the Martha's Vineyard Historical Society, the new name, and there it entertains the public. And the value of that lens today with the handmade crystals exceeds 3.5 million.
I believe it. I've also visited a Fresnel lens in Key West, and they are now treasured as articles of beauty, as art, as well as for their function. And how fortunate we are to have the one in Edgartown.
Well, the one we have here is unusual because of the signal. It was 3 whites and then the red.
And I missed that.
That was a very unusual signal. And then we replaced that with the double barrel lens, which is on loan from Vineyard Environmental Research Institute to the Martha's Vineyard Museum. It's still on display. But that was 3 whites and a red to continue on with that historic, that same signal. And even the timing of the signal is important for the mariners. So that the white is so many seconds, each white is so many seconds, and then the red is so many seconds. They really have it nailed down. It's really well defined. And then in the late 80s, again, because of parts, that was an unusual signal, the 3 whites and a red that replaced the Fresnel. They wanted it to be just the white and the red, which was a signal system in configuration technically that was similar to others they were installing around the United States. And they had the parts manufactured for all of the lighthouses in the United States with that type of system, so it was easy to maintain it. So that's why we have the white and the red today. But for continuity, we have the Fresnel with the 3 whites and a red. By the way, the sailors in the old days, it's documented, they would say, oh, it's very effeminate, as you know why. That the 3 white and a red dealing with a woman's menstruation cycle, you know? That's why.
Never heard that.
And it was referred to as that woman, that female lighthouse personification, you know.
Interesting. I'd never heard that.
Yeah. But so the history of the lighthouses is very charming, very romantic, and many people really who visit today, Richard Skidmore and Joan Latour, the lighthouse keepers today. I appointed them in their positions in the early 90s when Vineyard Environmental Research Institute had that lighthouse. And they've been there now close to almost 20 years.
And they feel passionately about that
They
lighthouse.
do.
And they love the
do.
fact that they can
Yes.
keep it open for the public.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so there's a charming, romantic, very intimate history around our lighthouses, Anne.
Right. Well, I'm going to say that I grew up in Edgartown
Yes.
and very much felt that that was my lighthouse and would go there especially on foggy days and listen to the bell. There was a huge bell at that point. And swimming in the water when you can't even see the land because it's so foggy and just listening to that bell and looking for the light is just one of the most wonderful experiences of my life that I will never forget.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, just wonderful. And I think I mentioned to you that when I was about 14, the Coast Guard painted the Edgartown Lighthouse. And I was down there a lot and started chatting with the guys, and I actually got to help paint the lighthouse. That was a big thing for me. They finally just handed me a brush and said, here. And it was the first time I'd ever been inside, as you say, for people of my generation.
Yes.
Now, my mother went to school with the daughter of the lighthouse keeper in Edgartown, and so got to that lovely old lighthouse.
Yes.
And inside. So
And
that
what
generation.
Year? What year was that?
Well, this would have been in the 20s and early 30s, because as we know, that lighthouse was done in by the hurricane of 38.
So that was still the house was
Still
there.
the house, still that wonderful
Oh, my.
long bridge, which was called the
Yes.
Bridge of Sighs, by
Yes.
the way, out to that lighthouse. And my mother also was fond of saying that her great-grandchildren, they were driving by and stopped to just take a good look at the lighthouse. And Emma turned around and said, she was about 3 at the time, she said, "That's my lighthouse. Do you have a lighthouse?" That's how passionately people feel about those wonderful icons.
Yes. Well, that's a nice story. See, you have your lighthouse story. Diana's Coffin Riggs had hers.
Oh,
You know,
because
many.
people do.
Yes, they do. And now, thank God that they're open to the public again, that history, they visit Cape Pogue with trustees of reservations and the other lighthouses that are now available to the public. So we're now creating a whole new generation of lighthouse stories. People have been married in each of the lighthouses.
Right.
So it's so, and they come back and celebrate their anniversaries. Children from the schools visit, and now we're creating, again, a new generation of stories, all surrounding our lighthouses.
Right, there's a personal connection, that we have a personal connection.
Very personal.
Now, I'm curious, who's in charge of the lighthouses today?
Good question. I was on the board of directors of the Dukes County Historical Society for 8 years. And while I was on their board, I was also, as you know, the founder and president of Vineyard Environmental Research Institute and had the 3 lighthouses. So in the early 90s, after 6 years of raising money, opening the lighthouses to the public, et cetera, my life was becoming extremely burdened because I was publishing Martha's Vineyard magazine, Nantucket magazine. I had the water testing laboratory, the state certified water testing laboratory on the island, my environmental consulting firm, Vineyard Environmental Research Institute, and I was beginning to write books. So the load was heavy. So I suggested to the Dukes County Historical Society that I transfer from the Institute the lighthouses to them. And it took a little convincing, to be honest with you, because they weren't all that excited at first because of their financial challenges. And they thought this would be a burden. And after I showed them the numbers, because of people like Ted Kennedy helping us, and the donations of people, the people that were visiting the lighthouses and making their contribution. Each person makes a contribution when they visit. The weddings that we were beginning to hold at the lighthouses. There was a cash flow that was adequate to take care of the maintenance to carry on the lighthouses without there being a burden to the Historical Society. So after several board meetings, they accepted the lighthouses, and with the condition that I stay on as the chairman of the Lighthouse Committee for a while, which I did for a couple of years, so that there would be my experience and guidance to help them take over the lighthouses. So they're doing a wonderful job. They put in that great spiral staircase in the Edgartown light, which now makes it more available to visitors. All the postcards relative to the island's lighthouses that you see from the early days, it's not just the lighthouse by itself. Usually you'll see people up there in the walkway around the top of the lighthouse or around the bottom of the lighthouse, having picnics, and the ox carts up at the Gayhead Lighthouse that carried the people from the steamship.
Right, there were excursions to Gayhead.
To Gayhead.
So people could visit the lighthouse.
Steamship excursions, paddle wheel steamships from Oak Bluffs to Gayhead, and there'd be a dock there off of the beach, which was more to the east of the cliffs, and the ox carts would come up Ox Cart Road and bring them to the lighthouse.
We really wanted to do this program today as a tribute to Ted Kennedy.
Yes.
For his help and his influence and his good works and his ongoing interest in the island and island politics and what we needed here. Anything that he could do to help islanders, he would. We know, for instance, a number of years ago, a lot of Irish immigrants were coming here and working for the summer on a number of vineyard businesses. And one summer it was simply announced that the government wasn't going to do that anymore. And a lot of vineyard people went right to Ted Kennedy's office, and sure enough, by the time summer came around, a lot of those kids were back. Some of them are still here on the island today and have become citizens. So there are many Ted Kennedy stories, but this is a big one.
Yes. Certainly, Ted Kennedy was instrumental in helping with the transfer, as was Gary Studs. of the Lighthouses to Vineyard Environmental Research Institute. The acronym VERY is what we applied to it. Also, beyond just giving me support when I would go and give testimony before congressional committees and in the correspondence, just that Ted Kennedy was there in my corner, said a lot. And they knew that Vineyard Environmental Research Institute wasn't just some organization that had this pipe dream and this wish and this desire to control the lighthouses. Certainly was to save the lighthouses, and Ted Kennedy, certainly his posture relative to saving lighthouses was well known. And as soon as he came on board with us, we were taken seriously in Washington, D.C. And I would say without his support, probably we would not have control of the lighthouses today on Martha's Vineyard.
That's a staggering thought.
And probably because things were moving so quickly with the planned demolition of the lighthouses, probably the 3 lighthouses, East Chop, Edgartown, and Gay Head, would have been demolished. Gay Head first, because that was the most expensive.
And
to
probably
maintain.
in the worst shape.
And in the worst shape.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would have been the first to go in. And it's also, though, the most photogenic and the most historic, you
Yes.
know. And out of all the lighthouses in the United States, Martha's Vineyard, there's no place that matches the small geography of Martha's Vineyard to have so many lighthouses. We have 5 lighthouses here. We are unique in the United States for the number of lighthouses in such a small geographical area, which shows how important lighthouses were and still are to navigation around Martha's Vineyard.
Right.
So Ted Kennedy, it was a pleasure working with Ted. I got to share personal time with him here and on Nantucket. I had many a dinner. Laughs. He could tell story after story. When you're at a table with Ted Kennedy having dinner with a group of people, you can be assured that it's going to be entertaining. And his stories are endless, Ann. And his jokes are endless. And his timing and delivery are perfect, you know. As we discuss, he's a great orator.
Right.
And in closing, and here's another thing that Ted Kennedy did. There were some leftover funds from the Sankaty Lighthouse on Nantucket. So what he did, for the money that was left over, he passed an amendment to a bill in the Senate. And $40,000 came through to the Vineyard Environmental Research Institute to take care of the East Chop Lighthouse. And so we had it completely sandblasted inside and out, put in new glass, repainted the East Chop Lighthouse, redid the spiral staircase. We fixed up the lighting room that was leaking, and even the fenrils up on that guard the area where you stand out, the lookout area around the lighthouse that wraps around the lighting room out there. He had us in his thoughts, Ann. We didn't even have to ask, and he did do a lot. And we're going to still continue to enjoy, I think, many benefits from Ted Kennedy. So thank you, Ted Kennedy, for what you've done and what we continue to enjoy as a result of your energies and your efforts on behalf of Martha's Vineyard in the day when you were in your position at the Senate. Thank you.
Nicely said. Nicely said. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much
Thank you,
for doing
Ann.
all this.
Yeah.
Thank you. This has been the Vineyard View. I'm your host, Ann Bassett, saying keep your eye on MVTV.
Perhaps we ask ourselves why we're always might be tied to the sea. I remember some words that my brother mentioned in 1962 at the time of the America's Cup race in Newport, Rhode Island. I'll paraphrase them roughly. They're pretty close to exactly what he did say. And he was mentioning about how life changes, but he was also talking about the sea, and he was mentioning that the sea changes, and the light on the sea changes, and ships change. And he was also talked about the percent of salt in the water. And he was pointing out that the salt in the water is the same percentage as the salt in our sweat, and the salt in our blood, and the salt in our tears. And so when we really go back to the sea, we are really going back from whence we came. And when we preserve the lighthouses, the others matters which mean so much to all of us who love the sea, we're really preserving part of ourselves. That's what we're doing. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. And I'm glad to be a part of this event. Thank you.